Welcome back to Security in the Age of Targeted Attacks, sponsored by Blue Coat, here on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. Our guest today is Aubrey Merchant Best. He is the Director of Security Strategy at Blue Coat, and I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. And so earlier we were discussing an architecture for specifically looking after that whole issue of encrypted traffic, what's in it, with a kind of man-in-the-middle setup. Describe that once again. We'll go through some of the elements and how an agency can implement that type of architecture.
So let's back up for a moment and consider, again, one of the things that we touched on. Many folks within the community that I'm engaged with are now coming around to the realization that maybe we shouldn't be trying to protect everything. Let's focus on those assets that are of the highest value, make sure that they get our attention first, and then if we have time left over, we'll figure out how to deal with the rest of the assets. So with that in mind, what it means is that you need to know where your critical assets are. So the first thing you're going to do, of course, is define those. And as part of that definition, you're going to be able to understand where it is that you need that sort of visibility. So if you've got databases with intellectual property, if you've got financial systems that have, otherwise sensitive information, maybe healthcare or human resources, this is where you really want to focus your attention on and make sure you have the visibility to understand what's communicating with those systems and have the ability, of course, to be able to interrogate, if not investigate, all the communications that are looking in and out of it. So decryption, of course, is part of that. I'll also say that, of course, having some amount of analytics on top of that is going to be very key as well to be able to discern those things which are anomalous. But if you think about what that looks like architecturally, understanding what it is, what devices are your end users utilizing, where are those end user devices actually communicating with? You want to be able to monitor the critical assets within your organization, and you want to have some ability to monitor the communication sets egressing your enterprise to understand whether or not they may have picked up something, ingressing or egressing the enterprise to ensure that they haven't picked up a virus, so to speak.
All right, so then let's say that you've decided, so personally identifiable information, for example, would be something you would encrypt. And in the case of federal agencies, anything of a national security nature, or otherwise that could affect a mission. And then you mentioned a man-in-the-middle kind of setup where that encrypted traffic is quickly decrypted, checked, and then re-encrypted and sent along its way. So how do you get that going? What is required in a data center? I mean, where does this capability reside on the network?
Right. So when you think about what that would look like, consider that it's either going to be a client-side decryption, so you're going to decrypt all the outbound HTTPS requests or SSL requests, or if you're protecting a server or a server farm, you want to be able to detect or de-encrypt the inbound traffic. So there's mechanisms to perform both. In either case, it's very simple to do. Frankly, there's not a lot of effort that's involved, especially if you're utilizing something like a Microsoft Active Directory that has a certificate authority built into the enterprise. You can just force your end users to trust that server's or that decryption device's certificate, and then you're off to the races. As a matter of fact, it's completely transparent to the end user. They would never even know that their traffic is being inspected. As far as being able to manage those cases where you're dealing with personally identifiable information or healthcare information, then of course what would be ideal is to have the ability to somehow categorize those websites to know that that particular URL is associated with financing, or that particular URL or URI is associated with healthcare, and then utilize that as a mechanism to effectively just bypass decryption of that traffic if you so choose.
All right, and so is that capability in an appliance? Is it a software capability, or is it a hardware? I mean, how does it work?
It's both. And being able to perform this at quote-unquote network speed, if you will, and that's, certainly I would consider minimally 1 gigabit per second.
Silicon for that.
Absolutely. So the notion of having a ASIC or some sort of programmable ASIC like an FPGA that's going to be able to interoperate with some software utilizing maybe an x86 processor to do some of the offload is what's really required to do that at network speed.
And so that's the Blue Coat solution then?
Yes, we offer a device that's called the SSL Visibility Appliance that's able to connect into 40 gigabit networks today. Certainly we have roadmaps that are going to take us way beyond that in the not too distant future. But we can perform wireline decryption with minimal latency, really measured in nanoseconds, to be able to give you that visibility that you would need to protect your infrastructure.
So that's the kind of appliance where, at least in federal agencies and probably in a lot of commercial operations, they would want to know that that your supply chain is also secure. You mentioned ASIC chips and so forth, and those are fabricated throughout the world.
Yep.
What kind of programs do you have in place to ensure that supply chain?
That is an awesome question, by the way, and thanks a lot for mentioning that. So all of our equipment is built right here in the United States just for the reasons that you suspect. And they're inspected completely along the supply chain. And the sources that we get our hardware from, let's just say that we're making sure that we're doing our part to protect national security.
And you can show that to a would-be customer.
Absolutely.
All right, I wanted to get back to the architecture because what you describe tends to be the data center and then the end user basic architecture. But there are so many cloud facilities coming into play here. So how can this exist with the addition of the cloud piece, especially if it's a commercial cloud or it's a managed cloud in which the software is not managed but only the hardware?
That is another great question, frankly, and I would say something that we should all be concerned about. No doubt there is big value to outsourcing services applications to the cloud. I mean, it's clear that there's a lot of cost savings that are involved with it. However, when you outsource these services to the cloud, you need to keep in mind that the requirements for you being able to monitor them are not any different than what they would be if that equipment existed on your enterprise. So when you think about what this would look like from a security operations center, they should be able to have access to all the log files, to be able to monitor and tweak the policies, to be able to have the ability to understand who's actually accessing the console and ensuring that the logs are protected and of good integrity. Mm-hmm. So if your cloud service is not providing you with that level of accessibility to the services that you are outsourcing, then maybe you need to have a talk with your service provider.
So it's really something you should build into the service level agreement, but also to make sure that the technical capability to do that is really in that facility that you might hire.
Well, there's no doubt, I think, that the technical capability will be there. It's a question of whether or not, one, the service provider is going to give you access to it, and two, maybe more importantly, is it going to be commingled with someone else, right? Mm-hmm. So depending on what it is that you're protecting or what it is that you're tracking, say, for instance, if you want to perform full packet capture on a resource that's out in the cloud, you probably don't want your packets intermingling with somebody else's packets because just the small possibility that maybe through some role-based access control, someone would be able to see your data, excuse me, and you prefer that they don't. So maybe in this instance, you want to have dedicated equipment for your enterprise within the service provider's cloud. Or if it is shared, at least you want to be able to know that and understand what protections are in place to prevent that sort of exposure.
Sure. And the other big sort of IT development that I wanted to ask you about was virtualization, because most workloads in most data centers now, certainly in the federal government, are virtualized.
Yes.
And so how does that affect that ability to monitor encrypted traffic when it might be a whole machine moving that is encrypted, and not just communication to and from an application?
That's a really great question. That's like 3 in a row now, right? So I think, not that the other questions weren't good too, but that's really, I think, very timely, because that's certainly the trend. When we think about what it is that we could do with virtualization, many of you have been probably tracking this notion of software-defined networking. I think that capability is going to grow some really long legs and take us to places that we can't even imagine right now, quite frankly. But it doesn't mean that we won't have concern for security, because in the flexibility, for instance, that's offered with software-defined networking is also the opportunity to potentially make a mistake in configuration and have your data wind up on somebody else's gateway. I was going to say doorstep. But these are the considerations that need to be made as we sort of move forward. So when you think about what that looks like in a virtualized environment, what we can certainly imagine is having some sort of security architecture that might be built into this virtualized infrastructure, not to say on a hypervisor itself, but in fact, virtual machines have network interfaces, albeit albeit virtualized ones, and they're transiting packets across the network to be able to perform their tasks and carry out the communications, there is the ability to monitor that communication, certainly. The question is, how do we do it smartly? And I think that the requirements for an end user, given a specific environment, will dictate what that architecture looks like so that they can get the visibility and access that they need.
So to bring it around, basically, though, whatever the content of the encryption data is, you can still look at it on the fly, see what's in there, and re-encrypt it and send it on its way, whether it's a data call or a whole application or a whole virtual machine.
That's right. I mean, but just keeping in mind that, when in the case of virtualized, effectively that means that it has to be done in software. So there's no reason why we can't decrypt in software. It just takes a lot more processor, right? So if we want to be able to have that level of visibility of encrypted traffic, then we're going to need to make sure that we reserve enough resources on that virtualized server,
sure,
or steer the traffic through a hardware device that can provide that functionality.
Just do everything through that same console
Exactly.
you described earlier.
Yes.
I guess the final question is, we've been talking about the encrypted traffic and the choice of what traffic you apply that to, so that you don't waste your time doing it on all traffic, which may not need to be encrypted. Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, though, can all traffic be routed through a solution like Blue Coat so that even the unencrypted can be monitored for what it might be carrying?
Absolutely. So, I mean, the way that our appliance operates essentially is we look at everything that's traversing the network interfaces, the link. It operates in line, as you can imagine. Folks that are familiar with public key infrastructure understand this notion of Diffie-Hellman, which effectively is allowing you to negotiate a session key as the session is actually being set up. So to be able to perform this authorized man-in-the-middle functionality, we need to be in line to effectively intercept the certificate and the handshake. So by default, we're gonna look at all of the traffic that's traversing that network, irregardless of the port number that it's on. What we're going to do is look for the actual SSL handshake. Once we detect that, again, regardless of which port it presents itself on, we're going to insert our functionality and perform that authorized man-in-the-middle. It also has the ability to act as a tap. So, of course, that we can send not just the clear text traffic, but also a copy of the encrypted traffic as well.
All right, sounds versatile. All right, we're going to have to leave it there. I'd like to thank my guest today. Aubrey Merchant Best is the Director of Security Strategy and Architecture at Blue Coat. I'm Tom Temin, federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM.
On behalf of Blue Coat, thank you for joining us for this informative discussion. You'll be presented with some polling questions as you leave the webinar to help us improve future sessions. We appreciate your feedback. Those of you who requested a training certificate for this webinar should receive it in the next 2 weeks. Be sure to register for upcoming webinars from the Capital Exchange at www.fedinsider.com/events. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you.